In my small town, there exists a story about an aspect of death. Within the world, there are many who bring new life, humans, vegetation, and animals alike, all somehow creating something new, creating life. What some don't know is that there isn't just one harbinger of death. There is, of course, the ever-advancing time that marches us towards that end. But those who collect when the time is up are many. In my town, he started as a legend. It was thought that the stories were told to keep kids from playing in the rain so they wouldn't get sick, back when medicine wasn't so readily available. Those stories continue to this day here, but there is a deeper tone of respect when they are told. It's as if when the stories were told to me as a child, they were spoken in regards to something real. His name was always the same though, Nimbus. It was told that you should be wary of the rain, to stay inside and keep to yourself, because along with the rain, Nimbus arrives. He is not a being of malice. He is simply doing his job as a harbinger of death, following the orders of a fantastically greater design, one we may never be privy to. A design that I tried to interrupt a while back. You cannot interfere with that march to the end. Every life ends just as it was intended. No matter how heartbreaking or unfair it is, we are brought and taken just as we were always meant to be. It's a hard concept for us to come to grips with. I had always been wary of the rain. Even when I was out of town for school, I would sit in my dorm and listen to the even lightest of drizzle bouncing off the roof. I would watch others walking outside and wonder if Nimbus was here for any of them. When I would hear of a car swerving off the road due to slick conditions, I would picture his influence pulling the victim to their end. When someone would fall ill due to their gallivanting in harsher weather, I would wonder if that sickness would be their last. I know that comes off as cruel, but I guess when you've grown up with the looming aspect of death all your life, you see it a bit differently. I mean, we all grow up with that looming. It's just my town was a little more vocal about it. Where you hear the soft patting of rain against a tin roof, I hear a siren or a calling. My mother was getting on in age, and so I offered to return home and assist her in the more physical day-to-day activities. I'd go shopping for her and fix things around the house. It was nice to have an excuse to see her so much anyways. The school had taken me so far away. There were several nights where a soft wafting of rain would come into town, and I would grow concerned. Despite my mother being the one who would tell me the stories of Nimbus, oftentimes accompanied by a glass of hot chocolate, she seemed calm, more accepting than I could ever be. One night, during rainfall, she made me promise that if I caught sight of Nimbus, to let him go about his job. This was the first time I had heard of seeing the figure being a possibility. I had always just considered him an idea or an invisible force of nature, not something tangible in the world that I could bear witness to. I wondered if other bringers of death also took a physical form. I promised her I would stay out of it. Those words were genuine when they were spoken, but it's easier said than done when you come face to face with that end. I feel like I can remember the sound of each raindrop that night. I can recall the difference in the rain smacking the pavement of our driveway and the rain trickling off the side of the house. It was a particularly bad storm that night. The kind that would keep people inside regardless if they knew of Nimbus or not. It was one hell of a siren. I sat and watched the rain falling outside. Individual pockets of falling water highlighted by the porch light that did its best to pierce the damp void. My mother had caught sight of me sitting by the window like I was some kind of guard dog. I could feel her eyes on the back of my hand, but I continued to stare. hypnotized by the storm. She whispered that she was heading to bed early. Turning my head to meet her gaze, I flashed her a smile, one I hoped was reassuring, and told her that I loved her. She returned the affection, and just as I watched the rain, I watched my mother ascend the stairs. The creaking of wood under her feet is another thing I remember distinctly. Now it feels like a song, a gentle noise playing when I feel too alone. I love you too. I really like those words. When her aging frame had made their way up and out of sight, I returned my ever-observant gaze to the window. With my elbow on the windowsill and my head rested in the palm of my hand, I surveyed the yard. I watched the lighter drops of rain dancing in a soft glow of yellow. It had been so beautiful on any other night. It was in that glow of the porch light, inside the falling particles of water, that I first saw the figure. Standing in the middle of the road, facing the house, was a dark silhouette. Something coming into form but not quite there. I lifted my hand from my hand and strained my eyes to get a better look at him, hoping beyond hope that it was just some guy, maybe lost or just a run-of-the-mill creep, but I knew, when he arrived guided by the rain, Nimbus. Although I couldn't quite make out the figure, I could discern that it was making small and intentional steps towards the house. He made his way out of the street and slowly strutted up her sidewalk leading to the porch. I nervously observed him, trying my best to be still on the guidance of the promise I made my mother. The front door was already locked, and I wondered what that meant to a thing like him as I watched him walking up the porch steps. He was shrouded in the dark and rain, so I was still unable to make out his form any more than when he was standing in the street. I lost sight of his form completely when he reached the door, and my angle of view disguised him. I waited, listening for anything distinct from the rainfall. With my eyes glued to the front door, I waited for something to happen. I don't know if I expected the front door to burst open, or for his form to slip through like there was nothing there. Instead, on the floor right by the front door, I saw a small puddle of water forming. Its gloss on the hardwood floor continued expanding. The water coming from no visible source, I rose from my seat and stepped cautiously forward. The gloss of the water was enough to create a reflection of the surroundings. I focused intently on the reflection, expecting that just maybe that was how I was meant to view him. Through my limited understanding of the being was tested as I watched a hand rise up from the pool of the water. The hand was dark, but more defined than when I had seen it outside. Its fingers gripped the hardwood like it was the edge of a pool, and with the visible strain, I watched Nimbus rise from the water. And there he was, a figure of legend and manifestation of fact. In my living room, I was confronted by a very tangible aspect of passing. I don't know what I expected him to look like, but the name Nimbus had always created kinder visions than what stood before me. He looked more like he had just crawled out of Davy Jones' locker than he had fallen from the sky with rain. His clothes was tattered and ripped, threads of it clumping together resembling strips of seaweed. The arms that dragged him out of the floorboard hung heavily by his side like they were chained to the ocean floor. Nimbus stood in the room oblivious to me. His breathing was raspy, and I could hear the bubbling of liquid coming from his throat. My promise to my mother or not, I felt stuck where I was standing. I watched as drops of water dripped off the torn clothing and fell to the floor. Where the drops landed, I noticed there was no proof of their contact with the floor. The wood remained unsullied as if the drops had never fallen at all. Then Nimbus moved forward to the stairs. His hunched-over frame clumsily made its way to the stairs, no doubt heading towards my fast-asleep mother. A mother who had always been there for me, one who raised me and made me who I am today, one I couldn't just let go of. Not if I had the chance to stop it. If you saw the Grim Reaper heading towards the person you love the most, surely you would try to wrap your fingers around his throat, right? Just beg for one more day. In kind, I stepped forward too. Don't do it. I spoke aloud to Nimbus. I could barely believe the words made it out of my mouth. But as I watched his body ripple as if I had thrown a rock into a lake, I knew I had gotten his attention. With his hand on the railing and installed for my mother, his frame shifted and his head turned towards me. His face was a deep and unsettling purple with puffed cheeks and skin that was just as ragged as his clothing. And suddenly, I couldn't tell where his clothing ended and his features began. His eyes, though, were a milky white as if he was blind, but in the center, where there should be the pupil, was a faint yellow light. His eyes looked like a firefly had landed in a glass of milk. I didn't know if he could even see, but he was looking directly at me. She isn't that sick. There's still time. Please. I pleaded with the creature before me. He continued staring at me. I can't explain how, but I could feel with the overwhelming indifference that permeated the soles of my feet like needles. No words came forth. But Nimbus did open his mouth, revealing teeth that had rotten down to sharp points. I heard the bubbling from his throat and recognized it. It was the same sound the rain was making outside. Countless beads of water striking hard surfaces. It felt like he was trying to say something, but either nothing came out, or I just wasn't able to comprehend it in my state of being. He turned away from me and started walking up the stairs, ascending to the one I loved most. I stepped forward, and almost as if my intent was sent through the floorboards, the creature's body rippled again, and he swiftly turned towards me. His hunched-over frame straightened out, and I realized he stood at least a foot taller than I. His frame, when fixed, was much more intimidating. The yellow glow in his eyes started to flare red, and when I tried to gasp from fear, I found myself unable to. Instead of air, a small collection of water spilled out from my lips. I could feel it all through my throat and in my lungs. One instant, I was able to breathe, and the next day I was falling to my knees, unable to take in any more air. I kept expelling as much water as I could from my mouth, but it was never enough. Air refused to puncture the ocean that was inside of me. Every attempt to breathe created a sound so eerily similar to the one produced when Nimbus took a breath. Barreled over, I helplessly watched him ascend the stairs. With a blink of an eye, I was suddenly surrounded by darkness. I feared that in my transgression Nimbus had decided to take me as well. But soon after that thought surfaced, I realized I was floating. I wasn't surrounded by just the darkness. I had been plunged into a void filled with water. All around me, I could see faint yellow lights appearing, and then the water around me seemed to light up, the source of which was behind me. I swiveled my body to face the source of light. A massive glowing yellow orb, and surrounding it, a milky white mass that seemed to stretch out into the darkness forever. How likely was it that the other small lights I had seen weren't small at all? They were just far away. I stared at the glowing orb, accepting that it was the same eyes I had seen from Nimbus. that the sting in the void may very well be what Nimbus truly was. I was surrounded by the end of the line for our kind. I closed my eyes, and the light stung even through my eyelids. What could have I done? How do you fight back? It was light walking up in the recesses of space without so much as a pale blue dot in sight. It was painful. Of course it was. I could feel myself fading as my body so desperately pleaded for just one clean breath. I could feel my skin start to wrinkle and the clothing I was wearing beginning to fall into ruin. I wondered if I stayed there long enough, if I would become something of an avatar to him. It was at that moment, in my dying throes, that I came to understand why such a being came to be known as Nimbus. Then the water rippled. A sound pushed the water around me, making it pulse. The sounds repeated over and over. Opening my eyes, I saw her. My mother just a foot away from me, floating in the same endless river as me. She looked much better than I did, and she didn't have a hint of fear on her face. Did things look different to her? Was it because I wasn't supposed to be there that things seemed so horrid? The sound was coming from her mouth, speaking slow. The words caused the water to forfeit around me. She placed her hand on my face, a hand that felt healthy and plump like they did when I was a child. Her fingers covered my eyes, and suddenly I felt my lungs fill with air. The air was harsh and heavy. It hurt my throat to pull as I felt myself letting go, and wondered how long I had been there. How long? I held my mother's hand to my forehead. How long? I had been grasping for air through my cries at her bedside. How long? I was going to drown in the ocean of sadness. The liquid on my mother's hand didn't come from the rain, nor did it come from Nimbus. My face was soaked by my design. It must have been hours before I didn't have the energy anymore. Eventually, you have to do what needs to be done. So I rose from my feet and wiped away the tears with my sweater. Heading downstairs, I prepared myself for some very hard phone calls. And as I headed to the kitchen, I stopped by the front door. It was still there. I had wondered if my grief I had lapsed into madness. But the puddle of water was still there without any source around it. Nimbus is a harbinger of the end. In a great expansive ocean beyond our limits of understanding. An ocean that can be kind or cruel. One that can suffocate you or comfort you. All we are is raindrops. All we know is raindrops. That's Nimbus. But when you're suffocating in that great ocean, when that darkness consumes you, sometimes words can break through the vastness. I love you too. I really like those words.